As you heard there, this week marking 30 years since Samora Machel was killed in a plane crash. Now, while the South African and Mozambican authorities celebrate the life of this dynamic leader today, there is still mystery which surrounds his death. For some context on what was happening at the time, we're joined in studio by ENCA's Dan Moyane. Dan, it's great to have you in studio with me. Thanks for extending your workday just a little bit longer so that we can have this conversation.
It's the second time you've done this to me this year.
I'm going to try to keep doing it. And let's just talk about, this accident, or that trip that was taken. A fateful trip it was, a trip that you were supposed to be on. Give us a bit of those details.
Yeah, good morning, Kathy, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, at this time of every year for me in October, I recall that time, but mostly the life of Samora Machel and the 33 other people who died with him. On that day, let us not forget, Mozambique didn't just lose a giant of the African Revolution, it also lost some of its top sons at the time and daughters, people who were really leading Mozambique towards a different future. I mean, you had top advisors, security advisors, you had some ministers who were young at the time, cabinet ministers who perished with Samora Machel on that fateful trip. And of course, there were some foreigners, the Russian crew, and some members, Cubans, who were part of his presidential guard.
Let's just backtrack a little bit. What was the purpose of the trip?
At the time, Southern Africa was a very tense place to be at in the 80s. In that particular year, it was 2 years after Samora Machel had signed the Nkomati Accord, called the Nkomati Non-Aggression and Good Neighborliness Pact with P.W. Botha. That accord, South Africa required of Mozambique to get rid of ANC cadres, Umkhonto weSizwe, and not support the ANC, to use Mozambique as a transit to come into South Africa. And on the other hand, South Africa was going to stop its support for Renamo, the rebels. 2 years later, Samora discovered, while he had stuck to his side of the agreement, the South African apartheid government had not. They continue to infiltrate Renamo into Mozambique. They continue to have clandestine meetings at Gorongosa base of Renamo in central Sofala province. They continue to arm and new guns and new uniforms and infiltrate Renamo through Malawi. So Samora literally lost it when he discovered that betrayal. He then threatened to deploy SAM-7 missiles on the border with Malawi, and he threatened to attack Blantyre. Malawi, under Hastings Kamuzu Banda at the time, was an ally of South Africa. Now, the rest of the frontline states were the ones who were pro-liberation, anti-apartheid, including the likes of Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola at the time. Then they decided we're going to have a summit to discuss what to do. Kaunda and Samora actually flew a few weeks before to Blantyre to speak to Kamuzu Banda and beg him to stop supporting Renamo and stop being used by the apartheid regime at the time. That's how they saw it. He refused. So Samora said, guys, we need to act. I need a meeting of the heads of state to decide what is the action. And Samora, a few months before, I went with Samora Machel and other journalists to Tete. He showed us the missiles where he had deployed them. They were literally facing Malawi. So he was ready to go to war against Malawi in order to make sure that the apartheid government would stop supporting Renamo. So the stakes were very high at the time in Southern Africa.
And what was then the importance of this meeting in the context of what was happening at the time?
The meeting was going to decide what action had to be taken against Malawi. Some people are calling for sanctions by the rest of the countries against Malawi, and whether or not Samora should go ahead with military action against Malawi, and what will be the stance of the other states against South Africa. There was a realization that South Africa, their military machinery, the SADF, was too powerful against some of these states. Samora had some support, obviously, from the Soviet Union at the time. He had deployed some missiles, but you don't fight a war only based on missiles. So there was a little bit of realism that came out in that meeting. We learned later when we were trying to find out what were the minutes of that meeting. But what was overshadowing the whole thing now was the plane crash in which Samora had died.
It could have been very easy to just disregard that crash as an accident. But 30 years on, that is seemingly not the case. There are questions being asked about whether it was indeed a crash or was it a sophisticated assassination. What was it that ruled out the possibility of it not just being a crash?
A number of questions. I'll highlight a couple of them for you. One, if it was a crash, why 2 weeks before the crash, South African Defence Force soldiers were on the ground in Kangwane, Bantustan, in Mbuzini. Nobody knew what they were doing there. The local people confirmed it in interviews with journalists. They were seen there. One of the survivors was Samora Machel's bodyguard, Augusto, who was lying there. He saw soldiers with torches calling for Samora Machel after the plane had crashed. Now, how can it be an accident? Why were they there? On whose orders? To do what? Number two, the pilots, the crew, all of them were found with incisions on the neck. It came out in the commission. They were found with incisions in the neck which were not consistent with injuries from a plane crash. They were like somebody had deliberately gone to their necks and made an incision to do what? To draw blood, to put... Nobody knows. But there was a claim soon after that by some South African settlers at the time that the crew was drunk. Now, why would that happen? Third one, most important one, why would the plane that had been flown by that Russian crew, had been flying President Samora Machel for a long time, experienced crew that had flown Samora Machel to many destinations in the world, not once, not twice, many times, why would that plane veer off its path? As soon as it entered the Mozambican airspace coming across from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, it veered right, leaving its normal course to go to the Maputo International Airport. Why?
Do you think that they still will from authorities to uncover the truth, given the fact that it's already gone through the TRC and other processes which have not been able to finalize that investigation? I
can't answer that, Keith, because I don't know what's going on in their minds and when they have these discussions. But one thing I know is that Graça Machel and the children deserve the truth. The people of Mozambique deserve the truth. The people of Southern Africa deserve the truth. The anti-apartheid movement deserves the truth about what really happened on that day. So there have been attempts, but they are not being taken to the conclusion to say exactly what happened. Yes, if it was human error, let it be conclusively proved that it was. But there's a story of that decoy beacon that remains today, because it was discovered that the South African police did have a decoy that was transported in the region and then ended up in some compound and disappeared. It doesn't make sense. If you had a radio beacon that you can use to clone a frequency that is used by the controlling tower to direct a plane to its landing strip, what are you doing with that? And then it suddenly disappears.
We're going to have to wrap up very quickly, Bradem, but I just want to, this is one of the things that you've said in your own writings about this situation. A quote by Samora Machel, that your life continues in those who continue the revolution. Do you find that still to be true today, that the people who continue asking questions are in many ways continuing his life?
There's a Mozambican expression that they use. It's called Samora Vive. It says Samora lives. They brought the plane down, but Samora lives.
Thank you so much. ENCA's Dan Moyane. More news after the break. Stay with us.